Guys, we are going to talk about Pythagorean theory today. If you remember, Pythagorean theory is a theory that we use when we are talking about triangles. And it works specifically with right triangles. We can use it to find out either the missing leg of a triangle, or we can find it to determine whether or not three numbers would give us a right triangle. And remember, a right triangle always has the right angle indication on it. And the first thing you always do is draw your arrow to the longest side. Remember, that longest side is called the hypotenuse. So I am going to just put hypot so you understand that is the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is always, 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 always the longest side of the triangle. And then you start from there and you move out. Our formula for Pythagorean theory is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And if you recall, I could take my triangle and I could draw a square off of the side of it. And my drawing is not going to be perfect, but that's okay. You kind of get the gist. And you're going to do it off of each side. If I were to take and do the multiplication, this side here is the smallest side. And if you remember, I kind of taught you guys to always make the smallest side A because it's just easier to keep them in order. Then the next side would be B, and it should be blue. So I will redraw that in blue because my B is in blue. And then the hypotenuse is always the longest side, and it is always C. Okay, so this one is going to be C. So A squared, which is the area of the square around that side of the triangle, because remember, A times A gives me A squared. Okay, A squared plus B squared equals C squared. So I'm going to take the the number that A is, and I am going to square it, and then I am going to multiply times, A, and I'm going to square it, then I'm going to add B squared, and that will equal C squared. Okay, so the two areas together. So let's actually take and let's look at some numbers. All right, so I have got these two. I am going to do this letter C first. All right, so I've got A squared plus B squared equals C squared. That's my formula. I can very easily see, here's my right angle. I take and draw the arrow away from it, and I know that is my longest angle, so that is C. 11 is smaller than 60, so this, I'm going to switch colors. So 11 is my A, 60 is my B, and then this one right here is my C. Okay, so this is C. So I'm going to then just fill in my formula. So A would be 11 squared plus 60 squared equals C squared. Well, at this point, you have a choice. For me, I'm going to slide over to Desmos. I've got 11 and 60. And remember, when you're in Desmos, first thing you do is choose your assessment, come down, find Texas Star, and start practice. And I am going to do A squared plus B squared. And I want to know what A squared plus B squared is. Well, I know that A is equal to 11, and I know that B is equal to 60. When I do that, here now is my B squared, or A plus B squared. So 3721. So I'm going to come back over here, and this is 3721 equals C squared. Well, if you recall, the way to get rid of a square is to do the inverse. Well, the inverse of squaring something is taking the square root. Okay, so that's opposite inverse. So a square and a square root counteract each other. So I am left with c all by itself. So the square root of 3721, I'm going to come back over here. Desmos, I'm going to say the square root of 3721 is 61. Okay, so that means this c is equal to 61. And so 61 units, 61 inches, 61 meters, whatever it happens to be. So my c here is 61. So this is my spot that my answer is going to go. So my answer here should be 61. So there is a trick in Desmos that I love that makes this whole process so much easier. You can take and put your square root sign in when you find your, or when you put in the original formula. So the square root of a squared plus b squared. And you'll see that immediately gives you 61. Okay, so do you have to do it this way? Absolutely not. You can separate it out. You can do 11 squared plus 60 squared. You can break it up and make it smaller. Or again, you can take and use it like this and make it faster for you to do the math. Either way, totally fine, completely up to you. All right, so let's look at the next question. The next one, again, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to label. Here is my A, 7.5. Here is my B. Here is my C. I know this because here is my right angle, and my right angle always points to the C. Well, if you notice, going back to formula, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, holy cow, I know my C and I know my A, which means B is the missing part. So I'm going to fill in what I know. 7.5 squared plus B squared equals 12.5 squared. Okay, so we can go old school or we can go easy and use math to our advantage. Ultimately, you know you've got to get rid of this because I want to solve for b squared. So I'm going to do, again, the inverse. Right now, my 7.5 is positive, so I'm going to get rid of that from this side of the equation. So I'm going to subtract it. That goes away because it turns into a zero pair. Over here, what I do to one side, I must do to the other, so I'm going to subtract that. And I'm going to rewrite my formula. So b squared equals 12.5 squared minus 7.5 squared. Okay, so go back to your handy dandy calculator. Going over to Desmos, I can get rid of this. And I can put in here my a squared. Or actually, if I go back, I'm sorry. If you go back and look at this, this is c. So it is b squared equals c squared minus a squared. Okay, so I can say the c squared minus a squared, or I can put in here 12.5 squared minus 7.5 squared and use the square root just like we did before. So that's what I'm going to do. Square root of 12.5 squared minus, was it 7.5? Yes, 7.5 minus 7.5 squared. Whoops, forgot to put in the 5. 7.5 squared. Oh, there you go. Answer is 10. So I know then that b is equal to 10. So b here is equal to 10. I'm all done. I can do it one way, I can do it the other. The last way is true or false. If I have three numbers, so let's say I'm giving 3, 4, and 5. Do those three numbers make a right triangle? Well, again, I'm looking at this. Is this side 3, this side's 4, this side's 5? This is where having your Inspire calculator is fantastic because it'll actually say true or false. Without it, we've got to figure it out. So we're going to put it in our formula. Here's my square. There's my hypotenuse. So a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Remember, the largest number is always your c. So that would be 5 squared. 3 is my smallest. 4 is my middle number. Well, I can put this in my calculator. 3 squared plus 4 squared. Okay, so I'm going to come over here. And I'm going to do 3 squared plus 4 squared is 25. So 3 squared plus 4 squared is 25 equals, well, what is 5 squared? 5 times 5 is 25. So sure enough, 25 equals 25, so I am good. So this is true. Okay, now if I had a 3, 4, 7 triangle, again, here's my triangle, 3, 4, and 7, I can set that up. 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 7 squared. Well, I know 3 and 4 squared is 25. Well, what is 7 squared? Okay, so if I don't know that off the top of my head, there is no shame at all in going, what's 7 squared? 7 squared is 49. Awesome. So I'm going to come back over here, and guys, you can do that. I did know what 7 squared was. But 49. So does 25 equal 49? Absolutely not. So this is false. A 3, 4, 7 triangle will not be a right angle. Yes, I can make a triangle, but no, absolutely not. It will not be a right triangle. All right, I hope this makes sense. If you guys have any questions, just holler.